Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is one of my short stories called Sarah and Conrad, Darius and Death. Well, that's it for me tonight, sighed Sarah as she leaned back on her chair and rubbed her eyes before moving across to her throbbing temples and down to her knees and thighs. Her entire body and mind were aching, gaping and desperate for rest. It was always like this when the company offered, demanded, paid overtime. "I'm not surprised you're done for the night. You've been here forever," said Annie, passing Sarah yet another grape. "And you're dehydrated, and only just back at work from being ill, and you've got the divorce to deal with, the children, and they'll soon be at home full-time for the Christmas holiday. You're done in already. I can't imagine how you'll cope once the kids are back, giving you no peace when they're fighting all the time." Sarah stopped the eye-rubbing and turned to focus on Annie. Whoever assumed that desk sharers always ended up as friends had never met Annie. Aside from her habit of constantly stating the obvious when it was least wanted, she had an unerring talent for making whoever was speaking to her feel bad about themselves. She wasn't vindictive or unfair, but she was relentlessly honest, and sometimes that kind of honesty was anything but welcome. She was certainly right about the divorce, much as Sarah didn't want to admit it. The paperwork was due back any time now, so the final stage was in sight, but it didn't mean it was grief-stricken time. Sarah and her husband had broken up shortly after the birth of their youngest child. He basically made his excuses and left, life with a family not being what he'd hoped it would be. Well, it hadn't been what Sarah had hoped it would be either. She tried to tell him that everyone felt the same, but that with two parents around, they'd each be able to make half the efforts. He hadn't seen it like that, and had moved on speedily to a new young lady who stated quite categorically, right from the start, that she would rather die than have kids. Sure, he saw the children, but only occasionally, and always under duress. No, Sarah's impending divorce wasn't filling her with feelings of gloom and doom. After being apart for 8 years, her feeling was that it was about time. Sarah suddenly realised she'd been daydreaming and that Annie had been talking to her. She didn't care what she'd been saying. She just needed Annie to shut up and preferably to go away. "Yes, well," Sarah began, and suddenly relented. She wasn't in the mood to have a go. She knew that Annie, despite her severe black hair, botoxed face and plumped-up lips, wore her makeup as camouflage, not as weaponry. Sarah needed an argument, but Annie didn't deserve to take the rap. That honour was for Darius alone. "Anyway," she said, "I'm sorry. I'm just not in the mood to chat about my crappy life. I'm just a bit delicate at the moment. I think I need to go home, run the bath, have a glass of wine, a microwave meal, and an early night. But unfortunately I've to pick Jake up from Late Stay Club, which closes in precisely half an hour. Then I've to grab Bella from the neighbours, where I'm sure she's boring everyone with the latest on her favourite YouTubers. Then it's a quick nip into Tesco, and if I'm lucky the kids will stay still in the car. Then home, then I'll have just less than an hour to eat, shower and get changed before the babysitter arrives and I'm out with Darius." Sarah gasped. At this rate she'd be fast asleep before Darius even turned up. She yawned and looked again at Annie's blank, disinterested face. "Why are you still here?" she said. "I thought you were supposed to be on a date yourself." "That's what I thought, but it hasn't happened. I was chatting online and he seemed really nice, and he definitely wanted to meet me, so we Skyped a couple of nights ago to get to know each other a bit. I've not heard from him since." "Oh," said Sarah, as she put on her coat and patted Annie on the shoulder. "Well, there could be any number of reasons why that's happened." Sarah suspected that she knew the reason. Sarah, already standing, had felt a little wobble as she'd got up. It had been 3 or more hours since she had last left that chair. Perhaps she'd just risen a little too quickly, but as she stood, swaying from the effort of putting on another layer and trying to work out how to leave Annie politely, the wobbles continued. "Hey, you all right?" asked Annie. "You're ever so pale." "I'm okay. Just need to go home," Sarah said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. This was what life had come to. Barely disguised exhaustion, mangled by dealing with kids and a job and a home and Darius. Deciding that directness was always the best policy with a slightly gormless but very forgiving Annie, Sarah said a quick bye, waved slightly and began to walk to the exit. The miles of office carpet, the same purple-blue indestructible pile on each of the 10 floors, was grubby. It was a grubbiness that the office cleaners couldn't control. As soon as they cleaned, it dirtied. The carpets, or crapets as Annie liked to call them, were annoying, but were positively sophisticated compared to the completely ridiculous and spindly inter-office partitions. Practically made of cardboard, they did nothing to remove audio distractions. All they did was ensure the hearer didn't have to see the person they heard. Sarah always wanted to kick them over, and her foot moved nearer, but it stuck to something on the uncleaned carpet. Chewing gum was a pain in the neck to remove. She carried on walking, one foot sticking to the floor with each footstep. Just as she arrived at the stairwell and lifts, Annie came running and jubilant. "He's just emailed me, said he was sorry for not being in touch, but he'd been ill. We're going out tonight, so let's wish each other luck." "Good luck," Sarah said, meaning it, mainly. Annie didn't reciprocate, but that was all right. It wasn't luck that Sarah needed tonight, it was strength. Sarah decided to take the stairs. Though she was tired and upset, and the 16 sets of stairs down from floor 8 weren't perhaps the most sensible choice, she knew how long the lifts took at this time of night. There would always be one down for maintenance. Her shoe falls echoed around the stairwell, adding an auditory brightness to a place which managed to maintain dullness despite the pale silver-grey walls and the occasional small piece of public art on every second landing. Almost at the bottom she stopped and turned. Damn it, she'd forgotten her car keys. She knew she had, because subconsciously she'd been aware of her bag's silence. Usually the large set jangled. Also she knew they weren't there because she knew precisely where they were. In Annie's pocket. She hadn't been lending Annie her car, heaven forbid, but she'd lent her the nail clippers attached to the keyring. Damn it. Even worse, Annie would have left the building from the other main exit, an exit that was about half a mile away. There was no chance of reaching Annie's car park before Annie left, unless of course she'd delayed to phone one of her mates. She did sometimes do that. Sarah decided to run down the 3 remaining flights and reach the final fire door, ready to hurtle the half-mile to car park 2. But the fire door was pushed forward just as she ran at it. She was hit in the head and was spirited to the floor, crumpled and slightly bleeding. Papers were scattered, and her drink bottle proved not to be as strong a plastic as she'd been led to believe. It lay smashed and leaking. Her scarf had fallen from her bag, and there, nestled within the silencing wool, were her car keys, minus clippers. Ah, she thought, that's where they are, before she began to cry and shout. The anger that had been building up for days came hurtling from her. "What the hell do you think you were doing?" she yelled through tears and reddened eyes. The door pusher had suffered a similar fate to Sarah, as their push-pull battle had ensured he'd also been bashed in knee, elbow and face. Nothing as catastrophic as what had happened to Sarah, but bloody all the same. Sarah looked up and was about to shout further, but when the door opened fully, she recoiled in shock. "Oh, it's you," she squeaked, and Conrad, nose-bloodied but head held high, walked right past. Sarah was late for the late stay club, so Jake was waiting outside the school with the one remaining member of staff. Sarah understood her stony-faced expression and knew she had kids of her own who'd be waiting. As Sarah's car screeched to a stop in front of her son, she saw his face turn from fear to relief and back to fear again. Her face was bleeding, her skull likely needed stitching, and her eye socket was bruised. "Oh my God, were you mugged?" the teacher screamed, all anger dispelled at what would be classed as a very good reason to be late. "I wasn't. I'm sorry, Jackie, I had an accident. Here, Jake, get in." He did so, happily and willingly, though couldn't divert his eyes from his mum's face. "Are you okay?" he asked in the way that only an 8-year-old son can ask. "I'm all right now I've got you." They sped off to pick up Bella and visit the supermarket, and by the time they were all home, Bella had confessed to being suitably impressed by her uncool mother's pretty cool injuries. "Everyone will think you've been fighting," and had sorted the microwave meals while her mum went up to the shower to remove the caked-on blood. She had only 25 minutes to get ready. Darius would likely arrive on the dot, and she didn't want to be late. There was no way that she could give him any ammunition against her, not with what she was about to say and do. This would be a battle to be won on her strengths as well as his weaknesses. Sarah stripped off her bloodied clothes, pulling them carefully over her head while she sat on the toilet seat, then creaked her way into the shower and watched as the blood fell in clumps onto the white-tiled surface. It hadn't been a good day. She was faint, she was tired and hungry and bad-tempered, and was hurting badly too. Almost inevitably she fell, taking the shower curtain, shower rail and her soapy hair with her. She was found there 15 minutes later by 2 previously unconcerned kids who hadn't worried about the huge noise coming from the bathroom, and by Darius, who immediately covered her sticky pink body with a fluffy, far too absorbent towel, which began to stick to her skin as soon as it touched her. Once she was protected, he took out his mobile and phoned for an ambulance. "Oh, Sarah, darling, what on earth happened?" he mumbled over and over. Sarah, conscious and stunned, allowed his comforting. There would be plenty of time to explain later, and then after that there would be plenty of time to express how mad she was with him. She pretended to be unconscious as he gave instructions to Bella, who was to knock on next door's house to ask them to take in the 2 children. She pretended to be unconscious as Darius stroked her head and patted on her arm in an attempt to wake her, and she continued the pretence till the ambulance arrived and gently picked her up. Only then did she rouse herself, and when she saw Darius's face she cried, but it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a cry of disappointment, because it was not the face of the door opener who'd caused her injuries, Conrad. She was still crying as she was fastened onto the stretcher, and as the children said their quick goodbyes. Darius held her hand as the stretcher was carried to the ambulance. He was texting with one hand, undoubtedly posting his heroism on Facebook, as he was never one to miss an opportunity. Or maybe he was tweeting for pity at #showeraccident. Once safely in the ambulance, she shook off his hand, turned over and lay still till she was woken by strong and professional hands trying to undress her. Exhausted, hurt, confused. Nothing seemed to make her feel better, but she hoped she'd dream of Conrad as she drifted almost immediately back to sleep. They'd met perhaps 10 years ago, when Sarah was still married to Christian, and before the time that Christian had realised that raising children actually took some effort. Conrad was the dad of a school friend of Bella's, and they'd say hello at the school wall. Parents weren't allowed into the playground at that point, as the school was attempting to inspire independence in their pupils and to encourage children to report every non-teacher adult they saw on school grounds. This led to kids reporting the caretaker, the delivery men and the support staff. But fortunately for Sarah and Conrad, at that point the normally diverse spread of kids and adults throughout the playground became instead a massed huddle of parents behind the wall. Sarah had manufactured her position next to Conrad a few times, and once had even said hello. He'd said it back too, then had said something else and something else. They'd still been chatting when the bell went. So caught up in the conversation was she that she'd missed saying goodbye to Bella, who wandered happily into school, while her toddler son fidgeted and protested in his pushchair. Conrad suggested they continue the conversation in a cafe just a few minutes away. Enthusiastically, Sarah agreed. Conrad had changed her perception of men as she came to the realisation that he wasn't the only dad who was fascinated by and focused on their children. She also realised that life wasn't always a battle between parents and kids, and perhaps, most enlighteningly, she realised that she didn't love Christian, probably never had. But that didn't mean she was in love with Conrad, although she was undoubtedly drawn to him. No, it was more the contrast he provided with Christian and the safety factor of him being married. She vaguely knew and vaguely liked his wife, and had no intention of breaking up a happy home. And that's just what happened. She didn't break up a happy home. Conrad and Sarah became friends who'd chat at the school wall and meet for a coffee once a week on a Friday morning. She found out that he was 34 and that he was interested in badger culling and embroidery. Sarah had been shocked till he confessed that the badger culling had been a lie in order to make the embroidery seem more acceptable. Conrad also read plenty. He walked, he cycled, he watched rugby and liked cheap milky coffee and high-quality wine. And once a week, as they sat in the cafe and talked, she discovered much more. He'd chosen entirely the wrong career for himself. It had, in fairness, been chosen by his parents, and he'd just gone along with it. Banking was a secure profession which offered great earning potential, but he left it after saving a fortune, then set up his own business selling bespoke woodwork products on the internet. By the look of him and by the designer clothes his kids wore out of school, He was doing pretty well. Conrad learned about Sarah's children and about Christian, who saw himself as less of a father and more of a figurehead for a family he didn't want. But their chats ended abruptly. They were spotted in the cafe, and the news got back to Conrad's wife. Even though he insisted there was no affair, his wife had abused Sarah in the playground, and Conrad's family had soon moved to a new house. Sarah had a best friend, but then she had none. Before they moved, Conrad avoided her at the school wall, standing as far from her as he could. She'd stand in silence or pretend to be wrapped up in her son. After 6 months, she plucked up the courage to text him and say she missed him. His wife had been borrowing Conrad's phone at the time, saw the message and went completely ballistic. Sarah never saw him again. So that was their history. Conrad and his family moved to the other side of town, apparently into one of those huge, sprawling 1970s housing estates, full of large, bland houses, all with huge gardens. Until she had been injured by him at the foot of her office block stairs, she had seen or heard nothing of him for more than 7 years. She expected a hello or a curt nod of recognition, but he gave her nothing. He'd looked at her, then looked away with what could only be described as his "oh my God, it's you" face, and then he'd walked past, ignoring his ex-friend who was bleeding on the floor. Wakened from her dream, Sarah felt pressure on her arm and heard voices sweeping into and out of her consciousness. Darius held her arm and squeezed it. The nurse checked her charts. "Where are the kids?" Sarah mumbled. "Next door neighbour, they'll be fine till the morning. I got them night clothes, etc., and they're going to do their homework, they both promised." Darius really did come into his own in a crisis. "How are you feeling?" he asked, but she had already drifted off again. In the first months of her 7 years alone, she'd sneakily attempted a bit of private eye work in the hope of discovering Conrad's whereabouts. She'd suspected that he'd stayed in the same town, but assumed he'd relocated his family to the distant edges of one of the more anonymous estates. And judging by Conrad's wife, she guessed that they were somewhere fairly soulless. Sarah had driven around estates for a few months, looking for his car with no realisation that she was actually stalking him. She still had friends, so she wasn't that kind of lonely. She was no Conrad lonely. And for all she knew, he might have been lonely too. She owed it to him to find out. But friends of his would clam up when she asked about him, even when she knew their kids still visited and their wives were friends. Sarah had given up. She'd got involved, she'd made a great many mistakes, and then she'd given up. And years later, she'd met Darius at the office party, and this woman who had assumed she'd always be single was now with a man, and that man was in hospital with her, holding her hand and organising her children. So why could Sarah think only of Conrad? Why did she have the greatest of desires to push her finger inside one of his curls? Why did she still remember how he punctuated his sentences, and how he took his coffee and his preferred sandwich filling? Because try as she might, and in her faint state, she didn't try overly hard. She couldn't get him out of her mind. "Conrad," she yelled silently within her sleep, and he'd appeared there before her, wearing pyjamas and playing on a harmonica. His kids sat around him, and her Bella was there too, singing along to some obscure pop song. And then his wife came in with a pot of tea, and they'd all started chatting, and Bella had got up to answer the door saying, "It's my dad," and Sarah had left the kids while she and Conrad had danced off into the sunset. Sarah woke suddenly and violently. Around her was silence, but it wasn't the silence she was accustomed to when waking early on a weekday morning, where the gentle clatter of the central heating and the snoring of the kids provided a backdrop to the occasional punctuation of passing cars and chatting pedestrians. She was obviously in a hospital. People were talking, clocks were ticking, trolleys were trundling, and an old lady was crying for her husband. Eventually she opened her eyes and saw a clock that was positioned directly in front of her bed. 6:15. They would be preparing for the morning changeover soon. She'd get a warm drink and then have to wait a little while till breakfast. And then at some point in the day there would be visiting. Perhaps she'd get to see the children. Perhaps Darius would bring them. Having not been aware of much since the shower, she idly wondered how she'd arrived in hospital and what was wrong with her. It was then that she remembered she'd seen Conrad. OK, so he'd bashed her in the face and hadn't even picked her up from the floor or checked she was all right, but she'd seen him. He was in her office block, and that meant she was likely to see him again. If ever there was a great motivation to get better and get back to work, this was it. Sarah didn't have visitors that day. Darius, one of her friends, her neighbour with the children, heck, even Annie would have been welcomed. But nobody came, and instead she dreamed of Conrad, of him passing her the sugar and saying, if you didn't like it so strong, you wouldn't need it to be so sweet. He had always made her smile, until he didn't. The nurses and doctors came and went. Sarah was told she was likely suffering from nervous exhaustion, and who was she to argue? They were going to let her home in a little while with a demand that she take things easy and take a week off work. But how would she manage to do that? How could she possibly take time off now when there was so much still to do? She considered ringing Annie or her boss, but knew that Darius would have taken care of all that, just as he'd taken care of the availability of her mobile phone. By mid-afternoon the following day, she'd made hundreds of promises about how she'd be well behaved, would take things easy, and how she would get a taxi straight home. As she turned up at the neighbour's front door, it shot open and 2 mad kids flew out, keen to attack their mum with love. "Mummy, mummy, mummy, are you all right?" Mrs. Middleton had always been known as that, and never as Pam. Today she led Sarah very carefully to her well-padded sofa and left her to rest a little before bringing her a drink and a modest slice of carrot cake. "Here, you poor lass," she said, but it didn't mean much. Mrs. Middleton said that kind of thing even when Sarah was in full health. "So, what are you going to do about Darius?" "What?" "You heard me, Sarah. It's obvious something's wrong. Tell me." So Sarah blurted out the entire tale. Of how he'd lied about his holiday availability because he wasn't ready to go away with the kids, of how he'd been sacked from his job, of how he was desperately worming his way into their lives in order to find a place to rest his head, and worse, of how he had refused to accept over and over again that things were over between them. Mrs. Middleton nodded at opportune times, but let Sarah talk, slowly and with rambling excursions. "So," she said when Sarah had finished, and was lying back on the sofa, exhausted. "That feel better?" Sarah made a feeble thumbs up. "And what happens now?" her neighbour asked. "I don't know. He's helped a lot while you've been ill. It's his way of worming into the house and to the kids." Mrs. Middleton nodded, but it was hard to tell whether the nod indicated that she'd already been thinking the exact same thing. Just then the doorbell chimed. Mrs. Middleton grimaced at the nastiness of the sounds, and leaving Sarah on the sofa, she went to answer. Sarah covered her body and head with the thick, fluffy duvet that Mrs. Middleton had provided, and snuggled down. "Sarah, there's someone here for you," came a curious voice from outside her covers. "I knocked at your house, but there was nobody in, so I thought I'd ask your neighbour if you still lived here." Conrad. It was Conrad, and she was looking at her absolute worst. Sarah could hear Mrs. Middleton directing Conrad to the warm armchair she'd only just vacated, and she left the room on the premise of making yet another cup of tea. "I'm sorry," Conrad said. "I was just in shock at seeing you again and then knocking you over. Are you okay?" Sarah slowly lifted the covers from her bruised and battered face, and Conrad's breath was sharp. "You're not okay," he eventually said. "It looks worse than it is," said Sarah. "Most of this happened in the shower later on." "Were you dizzy from my attack?" "Nervous exhaustion. That's what the doctors said." They'd never experienced silence between them before. "How is the family?" asked Sarah. "Oh, fine. The kids are growing up. I'm sure yours are too." "Yes. And your wife?" "Oh, Andrea's fine. Same as usual." Sarah rubbed her eyes. "Are you tired?" "Just a little. It's been a hellish couple of days, but I have mainly been asleep." Conrad stood to help Mrs. Middleton with her tray of drinks as she clanked into the room, and it was then that Sarah saw it, tucked into Conrad's belt. The cookery knife he'd told her about, the one that he kept on display in his office, the one she'd forgotten about until that moment. Mrs. Middleton laid the tray on the small side table and sighed as she settled into the only free armchair. "Well, this is nice," she said as she turned on the television. On screen, a 1980s sitcom appeared. The father wasn't tetchy, the mother wasn't stressed, and the teenage child wasn't chewing gum and blowing bubbles. "A perfect family," said Mrs. Middleton approvingly. "There aren't too many of those around." "Yes," said Conrad. "The world is too full of people who don't take their families quite seriously enough." Mrs. Middleton left the room. Conrad followed and returned after a few minutes. By the time he returned, Sarah had worked out why he'd come. She knew why he'd brought the knife, which he held in his hand, which was dripping with blood. This charming, manipulative man, who entranced her within moments of their first meeting, had come in order to remove the threat to his own perfect family. "Guess what I've been making, Sarah?" he said, softly and gently into her ear. "Coffins, and I've got a lovely one, hand-carved and just your size." Darius arrived too late for Mrs. Middleton. He arrived too late for her little dog and for the tea set that tumbled onto the carpet as Conrad pounced. But Sarah was protected with a warm, fluffy duvet. Conrad had attempted to prise it from her. He grunted and sweat dripped from his forehead. As Darius arrived at the front door to knock, he heard the crockery fall and pushed the ever-unlocked door inwards. Sarah pulled the duvet tighter towards herself and heard the sound of her overly reliably Darius and knew that he was what she wanted. A man who would be there in a crisis and who would fight for her and the family, even though he wasn't quite ready to share a caravan.